Welcome classic rock fans to another ranking video, 10 of the best, and today we're looking at the 10 most important albums in rock music. If you're new to this channel, please be sure to click like, subscribe, and do check that notification bell, and stick around to the end for a few honourable mentions. The first one on the list, number 10, is Patti Smith's Horses from 1975. That grand dame of punk channeling literature, spit and angst as she channels the spirit of Jim Morrison and Rambo into female form, stating rather provocatively, Jesus died for somebody's sins but not mine. That febrile energy and almost Dionysian spirit, especially those early performances at CBGB's as she lights the touch paper for the New York punk scene. And we get that wonderful Robert Mapplethorpe cover, which is enigmatic and striking. We get a very androgynous looking Smith that stares down the viewer. It's almost like a fuck you to the sought-after girl next door image that the music industry so yearned for. Now that is girl power. Without Patti Smith, without this record, she went on to influence a whole range of very powerful female pop icons. I think Madonna, definitely, PJ Harvey, R.E.M., even Chrissie Hynde, I think, has cited her as an influence. Number 9 is the Jimi Hendrix Experience and the album Are You Experienced from 1967. Hendrix took UK audiences and Eric Clapton trousers down, has to be said, with his own brand of impressionistic psychedelic blues. And Hendrix delivers the most incendiary, well, there's almost a joke there, isn't there? Most incendiary debut album in pop history, with his guitar shenanigans, dexterity and feedback-drenched squalls. It's all great stuff. Many argue that this album laid the foundations for a whole generation of heavy metal guitarists and cockwagglers, and redefined the guitar's sonic possibilities. And he asks us, are you experienced? To which Eric Burdon answers in the affirmative in his own Geordie drug slur from the platform that was the newly formed Animals. And speaking of Animals, of course, we get that slowed down vocals of Chas Chandler on Third Stone from the Sun, who was acting as Jimi's manager at this point. I don't think anybody would dispute that beyond the fretboard flash, Jimi possessed a very distinctive artistic vision. His lyrical surrealism, sci-fi screeches and priapic guitar posturings took things to a whole new level. As far as the reach of this album, Lenny Kravitz, Stevie Ray Vaughan both cite Hendrix as a huge influence. In fact, there were far too many to even mention. Number 8 is the Stooges Raw Power from 1973. Produced by David Bowie, who also helped this band to reform at this juncture, I think. Although I must admit, for the record, no pun intended, that I actually prefer the later mix of this record. This Detroit group were already legendary for their problematic performances, shall we say, with Iggy Pop's gratuitous trouser exploits, as well as self-mutilation, often to the detestation and delectation in equal measure of their then audience. If you look at that band's early album, the first album with that Joel Brodsky portrait, which is just a carbon copy of the Doors debut, well, it's the same photographer, I suppose. We get a very, it seems to be an almost reined-in Iggy at this point, even though his face is photoshopped to cover the stitches he had to have that day, compared to the prominent and bronzed Iggy that's astride the cover of this album. Raw Power is this band's latest swan song, although it sold poorly. It was hugely influential. I think it probably influenced every band there was on the British punk scene. Even the Sex Pistols covered No Fun, I think, on their Nevermind the Bollocks album. Loads of bands could be cited being influenced by Iggy and the Stooges, and this record in particular, the White Stripes, would be another one of them. But the list goes on and on and on, so I shan't. Number 7 is David Bowie's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars from 1972. There's quite a few Bowie albums that could go on this list, in fact, and the Berlin Trilogy was a huge influence on the burgeoning new wave scene of the early 80s. This melding of hard rock and glam. The centre of this concept struts Bowie's alter ego, which taught a generation the value of creating a striking presentation, I think. Has an energy and innovation with Bowie himself as a concept. Many feel that this is a kind of a half concept album. I don't know how you feel about that. But when Bowie announced on that stage at Hammersmith Odeon that Ziggy, that was the end of Ziggy, he just reinvented himself and enraptured a whole new generation of music fans. Without this album, I think it's fair to say there'd be no Sex Pistols, no Prince, Madonna, Duran Duran, Boy George, All those people have cited this album as incredibly important. Number 6 is the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds from 1966. This wonderful exploration of the shift from innocence to experience, which begins with the guitar that sounds like a child's toy at the start of Wouldn't It Be Nice, is without doubt one of the most striking albums of modern history. Many people argue whether this is a concept album or not. It certainly evokes a specific atmosphere. But nevertheless, many critics argue it's the greatest album of all time, largely composed and arranged by Brian Wilson. Of course, the rest of the Beach Boys are out touring, earning their bread and butter. It has a hymnal ache to it, with Sloop John B, of course, perhaps being the conceptual fly in the ointment. Sloop John B was actually presented to Brian Wilson by Al Jardine, who felt that the band should do this one. It was kind of revamped old sea shanty made famous by the Kingston Trio. But for me, much of the beauty of this album is not just the compositional genius or arrangements, it's in the vocal harmonies, the elaborate vocal harmonies. Bob Dylan said Brian Wilson should will his ear to the Smithsonian, or words to that effect. I think God Only Knows is one of the most beautiful songs ever written. Paul McCartney would probably agree with me on that one. And it certainly contributes to that heartbreaking grandeur which very much defines this record. In terms of this album's influence, my word, where do you start? Pete Townsend has lauded this album in his autobiography. The Beatles have said this album was huge for them. Even Radiohead on their seminal album OK Computer said they wanted to evoke the atmosphere of Pet Sounds. Number 5 is Elvis Presley, the debut album from 1956. My word, this album with its lurid pink and green sleeve was, my word, it was punk even before punk. It was the epitome of that feral rock and roll and that attitude. That wonderful live photograph of Elvis in full swivel mode. You can certainly understand why The Clash paid that tribute to it with their seminal album from 1979. Let's not forget this was when Elvis was dangerous, gyrating away into the homes of mid-Americans. RCA, of course, released this album. They, I think, managed to bring him over with the help of the Colonel, I suspect, from Sun Records. And they made $1 million from their protege's gyrations, dampening their young audience with an eclectic range of material ranging from gospel, blues, music that laid the foundation for the whole rockabilly thing as well. There are lots of rock-out tracks on this. Blue Suede Shoes, which is superior to the Carl Perkins number in my opinion. Lots of lascivious R&B and syrupy ballads just to pluck at the heartstrings of their target audience. In terms of influence, my word, where would you begin with this one? Where would you begin? Even the Beatles have cited this as a huge influence. So let's leave it there. Number 4 is Bob Dylan, Bringing It All Back Home from 1965. This has been described as the first folk rock album. It's a label that I've heard applied to the Byrds and even Fairport Convention's Legion Leaf. Mind you, that was 1969, wasn't it? Well, do with it what you will. It's been labelled the first folk rock album, but it's an album that had all the clay pipe smokers and beard strokers frothing at the gills. This album melding surreal lyrics with a real rock and roll swagger. On this one, Dylan pays homage to the beat poets, as well as, in the words of The Guardian, anticipating the surreal wordplay of rap. This is a truly momentous album. In terms of its influence, God, Dylan influenced so much in terms of popular music. I still think Freewheeling Bob Dylan is one of his most important albums. There's this one, of course, there's the Basement Tapes, which inspired a whole generation, guided a whole generation from the vagaries of psychedelia. Number 3 is Robert Johnson, King of the Delta Blues Singers from 1961. This collection of material forms what many consider to be the canonical text in the British blues explosion. Eric Clapton described Johnson as the most important blues singer that ever lived. Nevertheless, his influence is probably helped by his short life and rather mysterious death. We're talking about Johnson here, not Clapton. Even all that pish-posh about him selling his soul at the crossroads of Mississippi in exchange for his finger-picking prowess. Johnson recorded very little in his lifetime, about 29 songs, probably originally put out on 78s, which have been collated here for this LP. But when this was finally issued in 1961 as King of the Delta Blues Singers, as I've said, it became one of the touchstones of the British blues movement. terms of his influence, I mean, my God, where do you start? Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Cream. Another rather endless list, I guess. Number 2 is the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band from 1967. This is certainly one of the albums that spurred the whole album movement, which enabled lots of artists just below them a certain amount of artistic freedom, rather than just churning out singles and being constantly on the road. It is a huge cultural flag that said, in terms of musically, the times they were changing. It was the album era had arrived. It made a compelling case for pop music in itself being an art form, rather than just throwaway ephemera for teenagers. These McCartney-driven melodies, George Martin produced swirls of sonic genius. And let's not forget it's a feat of engineering as well that I think very much defines the 60s with that lavish package and that music. It's lush baroque experimentalism, from speeded up voices to early examples of sound sampling. In terms of this album and its influence, pop would be a very different animal without it. Number 1 is the Velvet Underground and Nico from 1967. The writer Baudelaire talked about a cultural shudder that needs to occur in art, and this one certainly features on the cultural Richter scale, or in the terms of conservative mid-America, maybe the cultural sphincter scale is perhaps more appropriate here. This album displays a twisted predilection for decadence and darkness in equal measure. Though it sold poorly on its initial release, sold very few copies, it said that everyone who bought it went out and formed a band. This has arguably become one of the most influential rock albums of all time, described by one critic as a sound of pop culture being kicked wide open. The first art rock album, perhaps. We get the dreamy, druggy balladry of Sunday Morning with Reed's hushed vocals, to the mesmerising drone of Cale's viola on Venus in Furs, which is a damn good weekend for most of us. And you get that wonderful Andy Warhol cover melded with a kind of urban voyeurism of Reed's lyrics, exploring the world of hard drugs and sexual experimentation. And Nico's voice as well, there's no doubt, adds an almost European sophistication to the proceedings. This album is still utterly transfixing as far as I'm concerned. And this album has gone on to influence Bowie, Roxy Music, Susie and the Banshees, and many, many others. Now let's think of a few albums that didn't quite make my top 10, but I think are hugely influential. The first one has to be Kraftwerk, Trans-Europe Express from 1977. This album was released at the height of punk with a sleek, urban synth sound, which had very little in common with its contemporaries at the time. The Guardian's gone on to describe this as a paean to the beauty of mechanised movement. It's certainly an exquisite album that went on to inform so much of 1980s electronica and new wave. The next one is the Doors' debut album from 1967, a hugely influential record that informed punk. I think the Damned have cited this as a huge influence, as well as the whole goth movement. And Black Sabbath, the debut album from 1970, which really starts the ball rolling in terms of the genre that is heavy metal. Yeah, there's lots of tributaries that flow into that up to that point, there's no doubt about that. But this album seems to be that one of those. It seems to be to heavy metal what Court of the Crimson King is to progressive rock. And the next one for me is Brian Eno's Discreet Music, I think it was from 1975. Many have suggested this is the birth of ambient music. I'll say maybe Tangerine Dream play a part in that as well. This is an album that establishes Brian Eno in his post-Roxy career as an atmosphere-enhancing producer. So there you are, that's, in my opinion, the 10 most influential albums of all time, and a few additional extras for you. I'd like to thank you for watching and subscribing, and I'll leave you with my closing catchphrase, which is hope you're well, staying safe, but more importantly that you keep listening.